Thank you, Ross. I'm here today just to talk about myself, which is surprisingly difficult. If you'd like me to talk about the new amendments to AS 3000, I'd be much more comfortable. But look, as women in non-traditional trades, I've gone a bit early. As a woman in non-traditional areas, I'm sure we've all been asked that question 1,000 times. Oh, what made you do that? Now, for the last 20 years, I've been giving a fairly glib answer. Oh, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And then I just changed the subject. But having to prepare for today, I actually had to stop and think about it. And it's the first time in a long time I've done that. And in doing that, I realised just how unusual it was. It was early to mid-80s. And yes, it was unusual because I was a female, but it was more unusual because of my, I think, family background. I went to a Catholic girls' school. The most technical thing we did there was needlework. I was an only child to a single mother. My father had passed away when I was a baby, so I never had that working in the shed with Dad and tools. I had a couple of male uncles and cousins. They were all accountants and actuaries. So I had no tradesmen in my life at all as a reference. And it was generally expected that I would go to university. But being fairly typical, year 11, didn't really know what I wanted to do. The career advisors say, well, have a look at what you enjoy, what you're good at. So I looked at year 11 physics, which was strange because I was particularly bad at year 11 physics, except for the topic on electricity. I was good at that. So I thought engineering. But at least I had the sense to be able to look at myself at that time and say, I'm not going to last 4 years at uni. I really felt I needed to get out and get a job, but I saw the value in getting a qualification. I started looking at middle level courses. I never really considered being an electrician at that time, not because I was female, but because I thought I was too old. I thought that all apprentices were 15-year-old boys, and here I was, washed up and past it at 17. But a friend of a friend was an apprentice electrician, and he put me right there, and he thought it was a fabulous idea. So I thought, oh, okay, I'm good with tools at working with my hands, I can do that. Now that's something else I've reflected on in recent times, and good with my hands and working with tools. I once changed the mower blades on my mum's mower. That was it. So on that rather flimsy basis, I decided to become an electrician. So I thought, well, who's going to want to give me a job? So I thought, I'll go with the big government utilities because they're more likely to have equal opportunity policies in place. But I think I was fairly right there. And I got offered several positions, but I took the one with the SEC, which is the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. Because I thought, oh, State Electricity Commission, they are electricity. Therefore, that would be a good place to be an electrician. Again, fairly dodgy decision making there. But one thing I can say about the utilities back then, they had fantastic training. So the first thing they did, they put all their apprentices into an apprentice workshop for 6 months. And there we all are. Now, training at that point in the utilities was really declining. Correct? Oh, okay. Better? Okay. This workshop was built for 150 people, and by the time I came through, as you can see, there was only 18 or 20 of us, and it shut down a couple of years after this. But that was my intake year. There's only 2 electricians there, all the rest were other trades. They dressed us in these horrible white overalls, so everyone on site knew that you were in the apprentice workshop. And we spent 6 months just learning hand tools, how to use machines, that type of thing. All the guys in that group had been to a tech. I was the only one who had no idea. So that time in there was really invaluable to me. How was I accepted in that group? Some of the guys were fantastic. Others were just horrid. If you look at just the ones in the white overalls at the back, second from the left, the guy with a really odd look on his face, he was horrible. But look, I'm assuming you've picked me out in the group so far. The guy directly behind me with the really grumpy face, he was the other electrician, and he was fantastic. And I can stand up here and put my hand on my heart and say I would have not got through the 4 years without him. He saved my sanity so many times. He was just great. I still actually catch up with him. He married a girl I went to school with, and I do owe him a lot. So 6 months in there, I actually moved out into the SEC as an electrician. We looked after SEC buildings. Now back then they employed 25,000, 28,000 people, so they had a lot of buildings. And we had high-rises, we had small commercial, and we had a lot of industrial workshops to look after as well. And as I said, the training was excellent. They moved us around every month or two to a different area, so we got fantastic spread of experience. What I particularly enjoyed was control wiring. You know, give me 100 cables and I got to do it up nice and neat, and actually that thrill of having it work at the end was great. You also have the messy parts that seem to stop women coming into this trade. I remember working at the briquette yard at Footscray. You'd walk in clean and you'd walk out at the end of the day black just from the briquette dust. We had a fish market on one side, we had the craft factory making Vegemite on the other side, so no matter which way the wind blew, it stunk. And I was doing things like changing a pump, submergible pump in the sludge pit, so that was disgusting. Probably my favourite job that I did was actually as an A grade. I was in charge of the job of installing one of the first lighting automation systems in one of our city buildings and doing all the programming for that. It was kind of a forerunner to C-Bus. But let's face it, it's not the work that we have trouble with in this job, it's the people. So how did that go? I had a preconception when I started that it was the old guys that I was going to have trouble with and the young ones would probably be okay. I found that wasn't necessarily the case. It was a real mix. But fortunately, I was in quite a large department, so you could really avoid a lot of the time the ones that weren't real keen on me being there. And we seemed to have a bit of an agreement. They ignored me and I ignored them. But sometimes I did have to work with those people, and sometimes I could go 3 or 4 weeks with nobody saying a word to me for the entire time, except for a practical statement like go and get the drill out of the truck. And that was pretty tough. What I've realised now is that the SEC was virtually like a sheltered workshop compared to what some people had to put up with. I was talking to one of my colleagues last week about this, and she was telling me she was in construction and that she went to work on a building site and they actually shut the entire site down and every person on the site voted as to whether they would allow her to come on site or not. Now, I find that absolutely appalling. And I thought that would have been in the 80s. And I found out, no, that was actually 1999. That was Etihad Stadium in Melbourne. And even as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, she was being refused jobs because they didn't have a toilet. I thought we were well past that, but as we've heard from the speakers today, we're not. But it was during my apprenticeship I discovered the value of a good mentor. I was towards the end of my second year, and there was a guy there. At the time I would have called him an old Italian guy. On reflection, I think he was about 31. And he didn't work with apprentices. It wasn't that I was female, he did not work with apprentices, full stop. One day I had to work with him and I was a bit nervous because of his reputation. But we got on like the proverbial house on fire. And from then on he requested I go on jobs with him. When he became leading hand at one of our high-rise city buildings, he requested I go with him, and he really wanted to spend the time and teach me. And that was fantastic. It was really good. At trade school, again, the guy in the middle there was in my class, and thank goodness for that. Really got me through but probably after the first year or so, I'd whip the guys in my class into shape. They were accepting of me, that was fine. But it wasn't the guys in my class that were really the problem. It was everybody else. You'd be walking down the corridor and you'd hear all these snide comments. Probably the worst thing that happened to me at trade school, and it was something that, look, I hadn't even thought of it for 20 years, and having to reflect on this for today, it came back, and I was surprised at how upset it still made me. I think I might need some counselling with Dylan later on. We used to do these board jobs. We'd have these big wooden boards that we'd do conduit work and what have you on, and we'd leave them there each week and just bring them out. And some days I'd go to get them out and there'd be offensive comments written all over my board. And they weren't just general offensive comments. They were targeted. Whoever wrote that knew me. Okay. And what upset me the most, and still upsets me now, I've really had to think about it, was that would have been someone I knew who wrote that. I suspect it wasn't someone in my class, just because they wouldn't have had the opportunity to actually be in the classroom when I wasn't there to be able to do it. But I did know people who attended that school on other days, and so it was one of them. And to this day, I don't know who it was, but it was obviously someone who was being nice to my face and then doing that behind my back. And that I found really hard. My trade school teachers were all fantastic, very supportive. but it was my third year teacher. He used to use me to help some of the other struggling students in class. He pulled me aside one day and he said, down the track, you should consider teaching. You'd be good at it. So that was a little gem of information I tucked away in the back of my head. How did my family cope with all this? Well, I don't know what they actually thought. They never said so. But on the surface, I had full support from them, which I really appreciated. But it was funny, we went to an awards night. It was for the Victorian Apprentice of the Year, for which I'd been nominated. And I took my grandmother along. And about halfway through the night, I just saw this look of absolute horror across her face. I said, what's wrong, Nan? She goes, did you actually want to be an electrician? I said, yes, Nan. Oh. She said what she thought is that I'd applied for a job at the SEC just generally, and they just allocated me this job where I'd probably wanted to be a secretary or something. And she'd spent 4 years just mentally abusing that company for doing that to her granddaughter. But during my apprenticeship and afterwards as an A grade, I was studying a associate diploma of engineering, and the SEC offered me a scholarship to go back and train as a technical officer. So I agreed to that, and there I was in another group of trainees. But this time was actually a lot easier. I think partly because, as you can see from the group, this time I was 4 or 5 years older than all the guys in the group, and I'd already been through a lot by then, and it made it a lot easier for me to cope. And even at work, I was actually the second girl through as a technical officer, whereas I'd been the first electrician. And even just having that one person go first, it did actually make it a lot easier, just with the attitudes of the people that I was working with. Some of the work I did there, I wired up control units in substations. I did appliance testing. When appliances are going to be sold, they've got to be approved before they can be sold. And so I did those approvals, which was professional vandal was basically what we were. I'd get them and I'd set them on fire and I'd hit them with hammers. That was good fun. I worked in a photometric laboratory and I was involved in the development of the very first compact fluorescent lamp that was produced in Australia. Of course, you know, by this time I was one of their pit-up girls, supposedly, so I started appearing in marketing brochures and what have you. Bob said all his brochures end up under the sink, well, so do mine, but this one I found still in the filing cabinet. When I finished that traineeship, I went to work at the Office of the Chief Electrical Inspector in a section called Appliance Policing. This is where we would investigate any shocks or fires that were caused by appliances. We also did the recall notices that you see in the paper. So an interesting thing I found there, once came onto my desk a child's light fitting that someone had imported. And it was a little night light, but it was also a money box. The flex was in figure 8 flex. And when you dropped the money into the money box, it actually fell directly onto the 240 volt terminals. And you could take the bottom out to get your money out, and actually the 240 volt terminals came out with it. So that was the sort of thing we were dealing with. That was a fabulous job, mainly because if I was bored and had nothing to do, I just got to go shopping to look for dodgy appliances. But by this time, our partner and I had built a house in the outer suburbs, and the hour-and-a-half commute was just killing me. So I wanted to get a job closer to home, one of the local offices, so I thought I'd go into inspecting. I didn't realise the can of worms that I was opening when I decided that. Huge opposition. One senior inspector was heard to comment, she will become an inspector over my dead body. And he was actually on my first interview panel. Now, I spoke to someone later who was also interviewed at the same time, and to give you an example, whereas the other guys would have been asked, what colour is this shirt? I would have been asked, what's the chemical composition of the fibres in that shirt? Funnily enough, I didn't get the job. But that local office wanted me to come and work there anyway. And with my technical officer qualification, I went out there as a district assistant, and I was designing supplies for subdivisions for 6 months. I then had another go at the inspection job with a different interview panel, and this time I got the job. So there we go, there's my authorisation to be an inspector. The guys I worked with were fine because most of them I'd worked with before. The electricians that I had to deal with were a bit of a different story. Most of them just didn't believe I was an inspector. One guy I helped out one particular morning over the phone. He actually rang my manager later in the day and complimented him on having such a knowledgeable secretary. But I found being an inspector a challenge because I was a fairly quiet and shy person, and for me to actually ring an electrician who was probably fairly grumpy about me being in the job anyway and tell them they'd done the wrong thing, I did find that quite a challenge. The inspectors, it was a real boys' club. I did join the Institute of Electrical Inspectors. I went to 2 meetings and I just decided I just can't be bothered with this, which was a shame because it would have been a really good source of learning. But as I said, a really big boys' club, and they just didn't want me there. I was actually speaking to one of my colleagues a fortnight ago when I was making this speech, and he's been an inspector for a long time, but I've only known him for the last 2 years. Now, as you can see from that, I became an inspector in 1993. That was 20 years ago. And he said to me, "I still remember when you came an inspector." It just sent a ripple through the industry. It was just unheard of. Because not only I was the first female, I was also the youngest ever. And that didn't help. But inspecting was, at that point, a fairly high-stress job. To inspect, for example, a house, the way we were taught to inspect it would take 3 hours, and we had to do between 12 and 15 a day. So when they were splitting up the SEC and privatising it, I took the opportunity to take a redundancy package. And I really wanted to just, at that point, get out of the industry. So I actually went off and worked at Nestle and made 2-minute noodles and lean cuisines for a while. But that was real, just leave your brain at the door on the way in stuff. I was never going to last there for very long. And then I went to work for an electronics company. I was making prototype printed circuit boards. If anyone's ever been on Melbourne's public transport system, I apologise, but the entry gates, if you ever see the little green arrows and the red crosses, I made all those while I was at the electronics company. I then had a couple of years off to have my beautiful children. And during that time, that inspection function was taken out of the public utility and privatised, and they started licensing inspectors. Now, I had absolutely no intention of ever going back to inspecting at that point in time. But I went to an information session that they were running just so I could keep up with what was happening in the industry. And one of my former colleagues from the Office of the Chief Electrical Inspector was there, and he said to me, "You should apply for your inspector's licence. Because you're an inspector under the old system, they'll just give you one. If you leave it, you'll have to jump through all sorts of hoops." So I did that. Came the time I needed to get back into the industry, and I thought, what am I going to do? And that idea from my third year teacher popped back into my head, and thought, teaching, I've got children, school holidays, that would work. But I'd been out of the industry for probably 3 or 4 years at that point, so I thought, I felt very rusty. So I thought, maybe I do need to go back to inspecting for a while. And it was actually at that point some linesmen I used to work with were starting a company, and they rang me and said, "Would you like to come and work for us?" So I did. For a couple of years, I just worked part-time job sharing with somebody who was semi-retired. And then I thought, okay, how do I get into this teaching game? A friend was teaching real estate, and she said, you've got to do this certificate for. And I thought, well, that's what you need for real estate. What do you need to teach electricians? I shot an email off to the local TAFE college asking that question. They said, come in and have a chat. I went in and had a chat on the Thursday, and I was in front of a class the following Monday, which was a bit of a shock to the system, I can tell you. And I taught for 10 years, and I loved it. And what I can say about my comment from my third year teacher, he was right. I was good at it. I really believed a lot in positive reinforcement, and at one stage I was teaching a VCAL group. They can be an interesting group of students. But there was a very young, shy kid in there, but I could see real potential in him, and I took him aside one day and I told him that. And I didn't think any more of it. About 3 years later, I found out he was the son of a friend of mine. And apparently for that kid, that was the turning point. That's what got him through VCE maths and into an apprenticeship. And apparently he wouldn't have had according to his mum, he wouldn't have had the confidence to do that without my comment. Now, I don't like to take credit for his whole career, but it's good to know that you've been able to influence people. When I started teaching, once again, all the male teachers there were like, a girl? How is she going to manage a group of 16, 19-year-old boys, testosterone fuelled? The guy who gave me the job, now I'm not going to repeat the language he used, but his comment was basically along the lines of, she's been an inspector. All inspectors are bastards, she'll be fine. I forgot, I had a little cartoon there for the teaching. Now, unfortunately, the writing's not only quite small, but disappearing off the bottom of the screen, so It's obviously a chemistry class, so I'll read it out. You're saying, for the 100th time, I have no idea how to make crystal meth. Now, look, none of my students ever asked me how to make crystal meth, but I can guarantee you every single class I had asked me how to bypass a metre to grow illegal plants. So, the TAFE I was at had a very strong female management culture, and they tried very, very hard to drag me up to management roles, and I fought it tooth and nail. It's much more important to me to be doing a job that I enjoy than to be climbing the corporate ladder, and I knew management wasn't my thing. But eventually I became senior educator because there was no one else, and unfortunately I was right. I hated it. At the same time, I was feeling really uncomfortable with the way TAFE was heading in Victoria. And at that same time, I ran into that former colleague, the one who'd encouraged me to get that inspector's licence. He was at Energy Safe Victoria, and he said, we've got a job for a compliance officer going, and we really want someone we need an inspector, we want someone who's got training experience, would you be interested? So I thought about it for about 3 months before I made a decision, but I decided yes, it wasn't so much if I wanted to be a compliance officer, but I needed to get out of where I was. And so I moved across to Energy Safe Victoria about 2.5 years ago. So what I do there, predominantly investigations. We investigate unlicensed work, faulty work, shocks, fires, fatalities. We're there to help the trade comply. If they don't, we also have prosecution powers. I also have the unofficial title of TAFE liaison. That means I get to talk to every third-year apprentice in the state. There's about 1,500 of them. I approve assessors and I audit licensing assessments. I just interact with the colleges when they need anything from the regulator, and I'm quite heavily involved in the new licensing assessments that we're trying to get going now. Once again, I was the first girl into this section. Seems to be the story of my life, as it is for many of you. And again, apparently they were a bit worried before I came in about, I think they think we're just going to come in and totally change their world or something. But once you start, they realise that's not going to happen. We've now got 3 girls in our section out of a group of 14, so I think we're actually well above the average, which is fantastic. I never quite gave up that ingrained idea of going to university that was instilled in me as a child. So a couple of years ago I went back to uni and I studied a Bachelor of Adult Learning and Development. So finally, 25 years later than she originally expected, my poor mother finally got to see me graduate from university. And the advantage of leaving it this long is that I actually got to inspire my daughter at the same time, which was fantastic. And I'm currently studying a Masters of Education, as Ross mentioned. When I first started the Bachelor, we were all mature age students. And so, it's like on the first day you have to stand up and introduce yourself and say what you've done. And so I've got up and I've done the intro, and you get that, that gasp of surprise you get. And my first thought was, really? We're 25 years down the track and I'm still getting the gasp of surprise? But really that goes along, I think, with what everyone else is saying. Maybe we haven't come quite as far as what we thought. Though having said that, 25 years ago, that gasp would have been one of probably criticism and horror. Now it's a lot more positive and encouraging. So just in closing, we've heard today from a few people say that sometimes it's the women in the job can actually give you more of a hard time than the men. So look after each other. There's some younger people here. If you get the chance to have a mentor, and they don't have to be officially allocated to you, but if you've got someone who wants to help you and teach you, grab that opportunity. For everyone else, be that mentor, because really everyone in this room is inspiring others. I think you don't realise the effect that you have. So, thank you.